Hello there. My name is Jules Walter, and I played Rennick, Jabba the Hutt's personal Nerf herder in Return of the Jedi. Here is Rennick's story from a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
Why exactly Rennick was hired by Jabba the Hutt to be his very own personal Nerf herder still remains a mystery. Perhaps he had been spotted out near the Dune Sea at some point, defending his herd from a naive chancer who thought he would be easy pickings. After all, it was only him out there with these large beasts. And the fur, horns, and most desirable of all, the meat, would certainly be of value to a large percentage of the scum and villainy who walked this desolate planet. But you don't last long roaming the deserts of Tatooine without being able to look after yourself. The herds were never often large in numbers, which was a great help if trouble ever occurred. The males were kept separate on the ranches to graze, in order to keep the females and the young safe. When together, they had the tendency to batter the females, and the young would often get trampled in the ensuing chaos whenever a battle for supremacy occurred. Originating on the beautiful planet of Alderaan, their importance led to them being exported from there to other worlds, primarily to the core and inner rim. It was due to this action that the species did not go extinct when the despicable Empire destroyed the peace-loving home world of Princess Leia Organa in 0BBY, whilst testing out the weaponry of their newly constructed space station, the Death Star, under the guidance of Wilhoof Tarkin. It was at this moment, after the act of genocide, that many systems who had been loyal to Emperor Palpatine since the birth of the Galactic Empire were beginning to have strong thoughts about their allegiance. Rennick had been on his own since 19 years old, after his father was taken by a crate dragon while he was out collecting sections of abandoned and fallen ships to build additional shelter for the family. He had the misfortune to witness it. This tragedy taught him that at any given moment on any given day, you cannot let your guard down in the desert and must be prepared for anything. He had first learned how to herd the Nerfs when he was 8. He had skipped classes and followed his father and grandfather as they had set off on their shepherding. He was spotted, and despite a stern lecture, he was allowed to join them. He became captivated with the big wide world, and through some gentle persuasion from his grandfather to his father, he joined them from that day on, much to the dismay of his mother. For this kind of planet and its terrain, he learnt far more from walking the desert than he could ever learn inside a schoolroom. Never back down, my son. Stand tall and ready. Show no signs of weakness, was the advice his father gave him after he had watched the two of them take out 4 Trandoshan pirates after an ambush. He was greatly respected throughout the miles and miles of unforgiving sand. He had gained a vast amount of knowledge over the years, not only knowing every possible route throughout this barren land, where they led and who they led to, but also from conversation with other desert inhabitants, ranging from those who he felt perhaps best to strike up a mutual understanding with for the sake of everyday life, such as the Tusken Raiders and Jawas, to those who he genuinely had affection for, like Ben Kenobi the Hermit, who lived in the Junland Wastes. All kinds of bounty hunters stopped him to ask if certain ships had flown by, or if a desperate-looking being had asked for directions to civilization, and occasionally, he was happy to oblige, if the price was right, and if he felt the tracked bounty actually warranted capture. He had a good conscience and was a very good judge of character. He once rescued an IG droid, stuck in quicksand whilst it was out pursuing a bounty. The Nerfs certainly came in handy that day, dragging it out by a piece of rope tied around the cold metal of the heartless machine. Astonishingly, he was given a thank you and a blaster pistol thrown in his direction before the grateful IG-55 went on his way. Rennick admired his gift for a while, but buried the blaster just near his home. He detested violence and felt one less available blaster could mean one less death. The one who tended to frequent the area more than most was the ruthless Boba Fett, who wore the Mandalorian armor. Rennick could certainly tell a story or two about the things he'd seen this bounty hunter get up to from afar, but he wasn't to be messed with, and again, there was an unspoken reverence between the two. On an occasion, Rennick had even kept an eye on his ship, Slave One. He never inquired why it needed guarding and wasn't at all interested in finding out, but the Imperial credits came in useful, and they stretch a long way when there is just one person to buy supplies for. Around here, if you don't pry into other people's business, you get the reputation of a trustworthy man, plus you live longer. The reputation increased greatly one evening when he was first hired by the great Jabba. The Hutt's majordomo, Bib Fortuna, had arrived by a mini-skiff and invited him to the palace at his master's request, and whilst enjoying a drink there upon arrival, a Gamorrean guard appeared next to him, axe at the ready and grunting something he had no idea what this huge, nostriled creature was saying. The guard was becoming more and more irate, and the next thing Rennick saw was the gleaming axe thrust up in the air ready to come down at him. In an instant, he had jumped up from his seat, spun around to the rear of the guard, grabbing the back of its head and slamming it down into the table at such velocity that it broke completely in half, and through went the guard to the ground, out cold. Silence fell for a few seconds, and then, as always the way, everything carried on as normal, starting with the hideous laugh from the Kowakian monkey lizard, Salacious B. Crumb. He had suspected this had been a test by Jabba, and if it was, he had passed with flying colors, and nobody ever bothered him after that. Over the decades, despite getting into an absolutely perfect routine when it came to escorting the herd, every now and then, that had to change due to the sandstorms. He would never risk the Nerfs, and even though he was more than willing to travel himself, he would sit the storm out. Through all the years, astonishingly, there were only a few occasions where he had been held up for an entire day, and the memory was clear as glass. Usually he would find some shelter and wait it out with just himself for company, but one cold windy night, having been observed by a Tusken scout, he was invited to join them and sit round a fire with the nearby tribe to keep warm, and he was told a story of what has now become a historical moment for the Sand People. Certain things will stay in a man's mind, and he had never forgotten this particular evening. They spoke of a time decades ago when a mysterious figure came silently out of the darkness and slaughtered an entire tribe of raiders, men, women, children, and animals. The Tusken Raiders do not scare easily, but this incident had them traveling with fear for a long time to come. If rumors are to be believed, if you can actually believe the word of a Toydarian junk dealer in Mos Espa, then it is thought that they made the fatal error of kidnapping the mother of a Jedi, who then died in their camp, and it cost them all their lives. How one person can wipe out so many Tuskens was sketchy, but Rennick had deduced that this was either accomplished with the mystical force he had heard about, or with one of the laser swords which was the chosen weapon of a Jedi and could separate limbs from their owners. He knew of these facts thanks to his conversations with Old Ben, who told him he had spent time in his youth on Coruscant in the core where the Jedi Temple was based. Although strangely he had been told by Ben that Jedi were guardians of the peace, so for one to slaughter a tribe sounded almost unbelievable. Rennick's instincts told him that Ben may even be a Jedi, or at least was one at some stage, and had decided to leave the order. To add to the legend, a similar massacre occurred a quarter of a century later, which was just 4 years ago from this point in time. Only this occasion there was information to fully back up the incident. A tribe were obliterated in broad daylight by an imposing being that was completely covered from head to toe in black armor. All dead but one, who made his way wearily across the desert to another camp, and having told his story to them with vivid description, they then in fear held him captive, built a monument to the slayer who was clearly so very powerful that this god-like individual could cause so much death to their mighty race, and then sacrificed the survivor, worshipping the monument from there on in. Despite the Tuscans claiming comparison to these two incidents, this sounded like two different perpetrators to him. Rennick had come across their huge shrine not too long after its creation, and he recognized the person who it was dedicated to, the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Vader. He would never have known this if it had not been for a chance visit to Jabba's palace many twin suns ago, while stopping to take a much-needed glass of jarwar juice before continuing on to collect his herd. The normal deafening atmosphere which usually involved conversation regarding plotting murders, possibly even in the palace, theft, and who they were hiding from, was stopped dead in its tracks by an onrushing Bib Fortuna waking up his master exclaiming, "He is here, and he has butchered 2 guards." Seconds later, heavy footsteps, and what Rennick could only describe as cybernetic breathing was approaching. Darth Vader took his place in front of the Hutt's throne, an irate Jabba commenting how not only had he arrived a day early, but he has killed 2 of his guards as well. It was clear that at least some kind of meeting between the crime lord and the Empire was planned, but evidently someone had changed their plans without informing the other party. It was at this moment the Dark Lord ordered Jabba to clear the room so they may speak in private. The inhabitants appeared to leave, but many just tucked themselves away in dark corners, not only hoping to hear what was being said, but also waiting for a signal from Jabba that it was time to come back in and show this overconfident outsider that nobody comes into his palace handing out orders. Rennick had left the palace with a few others. Once outside, Boba Fett turned to him and said, "They're all fools for staying. They'll be dead fools. Those who take on a Sith Lord and the Empire rarely live to tell the tale." Rennick had nodded in agreement, and then inquired has he had dealings with this lord before? To which Fett had replied, "I haven't, but I was contacted regarding a meeting with Lord Vader before he departs the planet." Rennick felt for sure that he wouldn't be seeing some of the palace inhabitants again. In the days that followed, after a brief conversation with Bib Fortuna, it appears that the Hutt, whilst in typical overconfident mood, had gone on to call Lord Vader a Jedi, and this had triggered immense anger in Vader, which did indeed result in some of his minions losing their lives. He had heard it said that the Sith and Jedi were sworn enemies, but to correctly rephrase that, thanks to Ben's history lessons, the Sith despised the Jedi. A Jedi, so Ben informed him, were not capable of hate, but whatever the scenario, it was probably not the smartest thing for the giant slug to say. There were also unconfirmed reports that the great Jabba almost choked to death that day. This almost nomadic herder liked to laugh a lot, and there were some good moments with Ben that he remembered fondly. They would sometimes talk way into the night at the hermit's habitat, sometimes until twin sunrise, and he would listen for hours to his stories of life on other planets. Tales of worlds covered in water, underwater cities, worlds full of peace, and space travel at huge speeds. He had thought to himself why such a traveler would want to set up home in this bleak, inhospitable place. He clearly had his reasons, perhaps for the quiet life, or to leave the past behind. Ben spoke of a true love that he had once made the decision to walk away from, and also the loss of a brother. So this man clearly had some demons and regrets. You don't need them here in this sea of sand and lethal rock formations where there is nobody, or anything to remind you of them. He himself had never been off-world, so it was all fascinating to hear. Rennick often picked up extra supplies at the market and dropped them into him, which usually ended up with Ben insisting he stay and eat with him. He never declined the good company, and more stories that would begin once a drink that Ben would always describe as fermented grains was poured. Although referred to as old, he was only approaching 60, and Rennick wondered if it was past stresses and incidents that had made him look aged. He considered Ben one of his few friends and was saddened when all of a sudden, he vanished, and he still hasn't seen or heard anything from him in the years since his disappearance. That's not to say that there wasn't activity at his home. On one instance from afar, he witnessed the place being raided by Tuscans, and he knew it would not be wise to intervene. If Ben, for whatever the reason, had gone, then surely he would have taken everything he needed with him. His coming and going over the years to Jabba's palace was, in fairness, a well-paid job. He never actually knew what his boss did with some of the herd. Every so often it would be down on its numbers, but in all honesty he didn't care. His grandfather once told him, "Do your work, earn your money, there's not much more to say." It was on his last visit, just over a day ago, that life for everyone associated with Jabba the Hutt changed forever. He had arrived at the vicinity to collect instructions for the next delivery and had entered the palace through a back entrance that only he and a few others were permitted to use. That small group aside, Jabba wanted to know everyone that stepped foot in his abode, and always through the front door. He trusted virtually nobody. On his arrival up at the main chamber, according to Fozek, one of Jabba's human guards, he had just missed 2 droids seeking an audience with His Royal Highness. This really seemed irrelevant to him until the next few moments, when he heard a word spoken that truly grabbed his attention. Jedi. He hadn't heard that name since his conversations with Ben many years ago. The rest of the palace had even got to see one too, via a hologram message from the smaller of the droids, an astromech. The Jedi in question was named Luke Skywalker, who seemed to be appealing with the Great Hutt to release his friend, the Corellian smuggler Han Solo, from the frozen carbonite block which was elevated and against a wall between a tauntaun and Jabba's head as Jabba's pride and joy, thanks to Boba Fett. This amused Jabba and many others watching the holo message. The Jedi also offered the droids as a gift, much to the alarm of the taller Golden Protocol droid. After this excitement had died down, Rennick had decided to stay here for a while, having heard these details. A few of his acquaintances had spotted him and gathered with him behind Jabba whilst the daily dancing and music commenced. He enjoyed dancing along to the band, but that soon came to a halt when he was stunned to see who he always thought was the Hutt's favorite dancer, Ula, drop to her eventual death, becoming a meal for his pet Rancor monster which resided in the catacombs below the palace. But nothing greatly surprised him in here, where anything and everything occurs. This action of Jabba seemed to delight the majority, and as the Golden Protocol droid was next to him, Rennick decided to give an uneasy laugh of approval in the direction of Fozek, as he wouldn't have wanted the droid telling the Great One that his Nerf herder didn't find it funny. Protocol droids have a very annoying habit of speaking the truth. Then, weapon fire, followed by a few seconds of silence and shock. After a very fast altercation thanks to an attempted interception by the Geronite named Dolan, down the stairs came a Wookiee, neck-chained, and led by a bounty hunter, which Fozek had recognized and told Rennick this was the UB's Boosh. Rennick used to see a Wookiee in the cantinas of Mos Eisley and Mos Espa from time to time, always accompanying a human pilot. This could very well be the same one. Not that he had seen many others, only one more in fact, and he was gray. A strange moment followed. The Golden Protocol droid, having spotted the new guest, called him Chewbacca. Rennick looked at him puzzlingly, and had the feeling something was not all what it seemed to be. How could this droid, sent by the Jedi Knight, know the Wookiee's name unless the mighty Chewbacca, as Jabba only a few seconds later had yelled out, was an associate of this Jedi on the hologram? He turned to the Corellian spice trader, Palejo Rishad, and said, "I have a bad feeling about this. There's too much unusual activity in here, and that is saying something." The protocol droid had left his side and shuffled down the stairs to His Highness. A conversation took place between the two, which then resulted in the droid informing the bounty hunter he would pay 25,000 for the Wookiee, to which the bounty hunter sent a haggling reply back of 50,000. This angered Jabba, and with a sweep of his giant fat arm, the protocol droid was knocked to the floor. The negotiations didn't last long after the droid informed Jabba that the hunter was holding a thermal detonator. Among the screams came a deep laugh. This impressed Jabba, and he raised his offer to 35,000, which thankfully was agreed. Everything calmed down after the Wookiee was led away, and it was soon reaching the time for Jabba's scheduled sleep session, along with the rest of the palace, which in itself always felt beyond strange to Rennick. His instinct told him this was a good time to leave. He had work to do. As he was making his way to the back entrance, something told him that the extraordinary series of events were not over. Too much had happened, too early in the day. He circled round the exterior of the palace to head back and begin his slow trek home. Time meant nothing out here, and that pleased him. Up ahead, he could see that approaching on the dusty track was a robed, hooded figure. At that moment, for some unexplainable reason, even after all this time, he thought of Ben. Could it possibly be him? But as the now clear-to-see human came closer, he could tell it was a much younger man. The traveler looked at him and nodded with a smile. Rennick raised his herding stick as a greeting, also with a smile. Steer clear of the palace, friend. Thermal detonators, angry Wookiees, and he paused for a second. And a lot of trouble brewing. The man spoke. Greetings. I thank you for the advice. I will tread carefully, and with another smile and bow of the head said, May the Force be with you. He continued on his way for a few steps, and then, Sir? Came the voice again. Rennick turned around to acknowledge him. Ben says, Hello there, and thanks you for everything. He will miss you. Rennick watched him walk away. He turned to continue on, taking everything in and feeling enlightened by this brief meeting. He turned around once more to watch the stranger go about his business, and a smile of happiness and content appeared on his face, as if he had just had a life-changing moment. A little further down the track, as he navigated through the rough terrain, something caught his eye, for down in a canyon were two ships, one huge freighter and a much smaller one-man ship. What they were doing out here in the middle of nowhere was anyone's guess, but he thought to himself, the owners shouldn't leave them there too long, because if Jawas or Tuskens spot them, they won't have a ship to return to. Hours had passed. He had collected 3 Nerfs as part of an independent job from a farmer and had delivered them to their destination. If a job or two cropped up on the required route that he was taking for Jabba, then he would always fit it in. He never liked to let down any locals, especially as it was their livelihood too. Darkness was falling, and he stopped to shelter in the rock formations. He always felt refreshed by the coolness of the rocks that kept the heat away. Having spent his entire life here, he could sense when a sandstorm was nearing. The problem was, no matter if you were prepared for it by knowing where your nearest shelter was, these storms could change direction in an instant and arrive a lot faster. Anyone new to the planet who decided to take a chance thinking they'll have time to make it to their destination usually end up with their bodies found months later buried under a new dune. He woke the next morning to unexpected calm. When he stepped out of his shelter, though, he felt very light particles in the air. It was certainly on its way, a couple of hours away at the most. After some large gulps from his water canister, he continued on his journey. It wasn't long before the silence of the desert was shattered. It was without any doubt the biggest explosion that he had ever heard in his life, and although much too far away to see what actually had occurred, he could see large amounts of black smoke soaring up into the Tatooine sky. Perhaps the Empire had sent one of their star destroyers down to take care of some business and had taken on more than they had bargained for. By this time, the sandstorm had gradually gathered momentum. He nestled into another set of rocks, and there he sat until it passed a couple of hours later. When it had completely moved on, he was gathering his items, and he could hear an engine stop in its tracks, followed by a lot of excited voices. It was a sand crawler. The Jawas had come out of their transport and started preparing a meal which basically just looked like one very big egg. He walked over to be greeted by one of them. This brood had passed him many times throughout the years. The one named Nonrev approached and offered him some egg, to which he politely accepted just a few scoops so he wouldn't appear ungrateful. They had reputations of being nothing but filthy little thieves, but Rennick had got to know them, Nonrev in particular, and they had a good rapport. The Jawa asked if he was heading to the pit of Carcoon, to which he gave a puzzling shake of the head. Why is that? Why? The Jawa exclaimed in his normal high-pitched Jawanese voice. The sail barge explosion, of course. Sail barge? Yes, the Hutt is dead. And everyone on board with him. There's a bundle of riches laying scattered near the Sarlacc pit, droid parts, sections of ship, weapons. Rennick had a look of disbelief on his face. How did this happen? Well, Nonrev said. The traveling word is it happened during a planned execution. Rennick said, this will have an impact on every citizen within hundreds of miles. It will be very interesting to see how things change on this planet. And he actually felt a better future for him lay ahead, despite the fact he had just lost the highest paid job he ever had. At least now he could extend his radius to other ranches and settlements and not have to stay in one area waiting for orders. He bid Nonrev farewell and headed on in the morning heat. He thought back to when he heard the explosion, and if his decision had been different the previous day, then that could have been him on the sail barge. He then remembered the robed man and his comments to him, and with his choice to depart rather than stay at the palace. Well, perhaps the Force was with him.